I'm in a pretty forest on a lovely day in North Georgia. It may not look like it now, but this was once the site of a top-secret nuclear research facility.
Dawson Forest is part of a wildlife management area that connects land from the north part of Dawson County all the way down to the south section near Dawsonville. For those who seek an outdoor adventure, this region is packed with opportunities for hikers, fishermen, and hunters. It is extremely important property because of the creeks and rivers that flow in and out of its boundaries. Waters from Amicalola Falls tumble downhill, splashing a path through the woodlands. It then becomes a creek that flows for miles and is designated as a high-priority stream in Georgia's State Wildlife Action Plan. Dawson Forest is also home to other waterfalls fed by brooks that appeal to the adventurous spirit, willing to leave the beaten path. Wildcat, Cochrane, Shoal are all clear streams bouncing across rocky terrain. The forest is part of the Etowah River watershed, which hosts more than 70 native fish species, some of them endangered. The Etowah and all its tributaries feed Lake Allatoona, which supplies drinking water and electricity to residents in North Georgia. For all of these reasons, the Department of Natural Resources has purchased or leased land surrounding these waters. That is why, when you look at this map of the Dawson Forest Wildlife Area, it is an oddly shaped string of protected land, a patchwork quilt of natural areas that the state has been able to acquire or enhance for wildlife. The very bottom chunk is actually owned by the city of Atlanta. It is managed by the Georgia Forestry Commission and groomed for hunting and fishing by DNR. Although it may not be the prettiest section of forest, this place has a history that is amazing. At first glance, the Atlanta tract seems undisturbed and peaceful. But if you are an unsuspecting visitor walking alone in the forest and spot this in the distance, it may give you chills. What's behind those walls? It looks like the scene from a horror movie. Keep moving fast. You will come upon another building, tucked behind trees and hidden by vines. The story about these buildings may not be a thriller, but it does sound a bit like a science fiction movie. As barbed wire on a chain link fence and warning signs indicate, what happened here is very real.
The sign stands just off U.S. Highway 19, about 60 miles north of Marietta. From that point, it directs traffic down the access road to Air Force Plant 67, operated for the United States Air Force by Lockheed Georgia Division. Not too many months ago, this 11,000-acre site at Dawsonville was only an expanse of wooded hills. Then the bulldozers moved in. They came, did their jobs, and moved on. And behind them, buildings began to grow, structures designed to house the complex instruments of nuclear science.
There were other Air Force facilities built around the same time. The U.S. wanted a nuclear-powered aircraft. By 1951, the Air Force was testing a prototype that carried a reactor on board. A major concern was how to shield the flight crew from radiation.
Radiation levels are measured by the flight test engineer in the cabin as well as throughout the airplane fuselage during reactor operation. Flux patterns of air-scattered radiation around the nuclear test aircraft are obtained by special instruments in the B-50 escort plane. These first airborne reactor tests at Convair, Fort Worth, are supplying valuable information. Such information is vital to the design of the Air Force's first nuclear-powered aircraft.
By the mid-50s, the Air Force had a large laboratory on the Etowah River near Dawsonville. A bomber that could run for weeks without refueling would be a game changer in any conflict. Scattered around the Atlanta tract, you can still see remnants of a Cold War dream. Today, Tony Page with the Georgia Forestry Commission helps manage the property.
All right. There's graffiti everywhere.
That's part of our management. We deal with that on a regular basis. We
It's hard to
paint
stop.
over it, then you come back a month later and it's time to paint over it again.
Golden love.
It is a bizarre location on many levels. This is where a nuclear reactor was housed underground. The reactor is gone, the hole filled with concrete, and nature has taken back her land.
This location where we're currently located is the old reactor location. And this building behind me is a stairwell. And my understanding is there's an equipment elevator there. And to my left is the old entrance tunnel. And it's a tunnel that's about 10 feet wide and it's about 7 feet tall. And it's just large enough for some of the old military Jeeps. And that's how they made entrance down into the reactor location.
Much of Tony's effort goes into keeping people out of the structures that remain, including a lot of underground tunnels.
They want to get in there. They want to get in there, and really not a lot to see. The tunnels, most of it's flooded depending on the water table.
In this video produced by local film enthusiasts, you see how the curious managed to gain access.
Well, my face is pretty much touching the ceiling right now. I don't like that.
Today, the lab is completely flooded. Since it lies partially below the natural water table, pumps were required to keep the lab dry when it was operational. When the lab was decommissioned in 1971, power to the pumps was shut off and the bottom 4 levels were completely flooded. Now, only the top level is accessible.
Graffiti on the walls shows how many visitors have broken through. Since this video was made, the Forestry Commission has filled the entrance with concrete and rocks, preventing access. Initially, there were concerns about high radiation levels, but today, the fear is that the tunnels may collapse. Randy Abernathy says he worked for the facility when there were about 200 employees.
I was a design technician, they called us back then. I was still in college. And I started here in 1966 and left here in late 69. What I worked on mostly was for Apollo, got in the tail end of Gemini for NASA.
You're kidding me?
No.
All that was here?
Yep. Well, what we did here was a small amount. We developed a little item called a liquid hydrogen quality meter, and the idea was to determine, for NASA to determine whether or not they were going to be able to recover some of that very expensive liquid hydrogen from the Saturn V boosters. They couldn't recover it, but they wanted to know about it, so they spent millions of dollars for us to develop it and figure out that.
Randy says by the time he arrived, the idea of flying an atomic airplane had been dropped.
Were they trying to develop a way to use the nuclear fuel? Is that
They were trying to develop a way to power an aircraft with a nuclear reactor. As they found out, it just wasn't a practical thing to do. I've heard numerous reasons. One was the possibility of crashing. What are you going to do with all the radioactivity that might occur if your plane crashed? Others mentioned things like, well, how are you going to supply somebody staying in the air for 6 weeks? You'd have to have multiple crews, you'd have to have medical capability, I mean, basically like a submarine or an aircraft carrier.
There are slabs of concrete where buildings used to be. None of these trees were here. A guardhouse, laboratories, and office space for engineers took up a lot of the space. And there were 2 nuclear reactors on site.
What did they need a reactor for?
We had to irradiate samples. What we would do is we would take material, well, let's say you wanted to see what the effect on flour was of gamma rays. Then load the flour onto a dedicated rail car, take that rail car, move it into the reactor building, and then lift the reactor. Now the reactor was open air. It means there was no shielding around it when it was up and running.
Well,
so nobody could be around it within, half-mile radius or more, I guess. And there wasn't a lot of vegetation right around where it was either. But we didn't have mutant items. Most people would say you probably did, but we didn't. But anyway, they would irradiate that. Then they would, that same rail line came through, and back over here was what we call a radiation effects lab. The hot cells still stand there. And they would bring whatever specimen into there, and then using the mechanical manipulator arms, the physicists, scientists, engineers, whatever was working on it, they would then determine what the effect was on the item.
The analytical lab is already functioning smoothly. Here, the effects of radiation on the test articles will be analyzed and recorded. It is expected that from findings in the analytical lab will come some of the answers needed for nuclear flight.
Despite the fact that the nuclear flight mission was canceled here, experimentation continued, with the reactors being pulled up to blast everything from metal to wood. Scientists tested a wide range of plant life in foods. There was also a radiation test on migratory bird patterns.
there are roads that crisscross throughout this forest, many of them used by the hundreds of employees who worked for the nuclear facility.
Today, horseback riders pull up their rigs where a 600-car parking lot used to be.
All right.
It is a beautiful place to ride, with well-maintained trails. You'll find folks riding just about any day the sun is out. The area around this forest has been developed with shopping malls and residential areas. But here, it is still peaceful, with about 10,000 acres of wooded land and streams. It wasn't always this way. Author James Mahaffey talks about the forest in his book, Atomic Awakening. He writes that the first time the radiation effects reactor ran at full power, quote, bugs fell out of the sky in mid-buzz, and mighty oaks turned brown. It's hard to believe with the sun shining through the forest and flowers blooming at your feet. Barty Simonton works for Georgia DNR and monitored this land for radiation levels from 1989 until 2006. he lets us go behind the barbed wire fence.
Into the hot zone. Not really.
No.
Wow, look at that.
All the metal plates you see, these were just piping penetrations that went through the wall for ventilation, various testing equipment and whatnot. And so
they would bring things in on a rail to test the radiation on those objects, but people were not in there.
No. Well, there would be people in there at times, but most of it, yes, they would do. A lot of it was done remotely. They would bring in and they would test, do destructive testing on it to test for brittleness, what effects that it was having on the metals that they were testing.
According to Barty, these walls are 6 feet thick.
It's hot. I'm kidding, it's cold. This is so amazing to me. This thing's huge.
It doesn't show this, but there was a whole another building that covered this entire area. That was just a metal butler type building, that was built on this. And this was just included in that structure.
So this was enclosed by yet another building.
Right. When they decommissioned the site, they tore all the old building down, but they left this because it was more dangerous to try to tear all of this down than it was to leave it in place. I don't know if we can get around to it, but on the far side down here is where the opening was, where the rail car would come in.
Let's try.
Just watch your head with that, where it's sticking out there.
Oh yeah, I see it. So all of these metal pieces were various pipes, and I see they've all been filled with cement.
But still, people would try to break into them. So we came in, like I said, a few years ago, and they covered it with these boilerplate and welded all that on there to keep people from trying to break into it anymore.
There's the door.
Yep, that's where
So this is where the rail cars came in.
Right.
And it looks like somebody's been trying to bang their way through.
Yeah, they still try to get in every once in a while.
So
they come in and fix it.
So was there a railway that went?
Yes, ma'am. The railway went through right through here. The old roadbed you see out in the front here that we walked in on was part of the railway as they came in.
The railroad between the Radiation Effects Laboratory and the Radiation Effects Facility is 2.5 miles long. It crosses the Etowah River and enters the hill country. Then, after a brief journey, emerges in sight of the reactor building.
The rail also traveled to this site, deep in the woods, where an unshielded reactor rested in the equivalent of a swimming pool. Engineers lifted the reactor from the pool, allowing scientists to bombard anything in a 1,000-foot circle with a lethal dose of radiation.
From there, it would be rolled out and over to what we call the cooling off area, which is an area about halfway between the reactor area here. And the material would not only get hot with radiation, but it would get thermally hot and from the bombardment of the radiation. And so they would allow it to sit there and cool off for a period of time. And then they would bring it over here, roll it in here.
According to author James Mahaffey, this was the largest radiation exposure facility in the world. Engineers learned that materials like rubber tires near the reactor turned hard as rock, and clear glass turned brown. This became an experimental forest. What would happen to wildlife in the hot zone? Radiation testing began when the reactors were removed, and the facility was finally decommissioned in 1971. Animals, plants, and water had to be watched closely for any unusual effects. But the trees around the reactors returned, and after years of monitoring, radiation levels were deemed normal. Even though the testing has stopped and the state has given the forest a green light for safety, the rumors continue about what went on up in those hills.
I get a lot of calls, people, especially in the fall when deer hunting season opens. I get this question all the time. People will call and say, have you seen any of the three-legged deer walking on the property? Or have you seen a deer that has two heads? And it's, no, we haven't seen that. But that story's out there. That story's out there.
Native Americans once lived in this region, fishing and hunting. Perhaps in the same place, a reactor was built. In the early 1800s, people used to pan for gold in the streams that run through Dawson Forest. Now, there are few traces of the huge nuclear complex that was part of America's military and aviation programs. There is a waterfall you can easily access, with rocks to climb and streams to fish in. Today, the Department of Natural Resources keeps many of the Dawson Forest waters stocked with trout. Trout fishing is one of the most popular sports in North Georgia.
The primary goal here is, believe it or not, is water quality. We have the Shoal Creek, Etowah River, the Amicalola Creek flows through the property, and so the primary goal here is to reduce erosion and maintain water quality.
In addition, the Georgia Forestry Commission carries out regular prescribed burns and reforestation projects. It keeps the beneficial trees healthy by burning undergrowth and competing vegetation. Then some of the timber is sold and the money goes to Atlanta. At one time, this land was thought to be a good site for another city airport, but those plans were abandoned, and now this is simply a working forest. The Atlanta tract is a little more than 10,000 acres out of the 25,000 acres in the entire Dawson Forest Wildlife Management Area.
With any property, you give it some time with a little encouragement, a little management, Mother Nature will heal whatever has taken place. And this property is a prime example of that. Prior to the facility, it was just a wooded area, and the previous landowner built this property from different farms. It was private land, and then once he accumulated enough to make up the 10,000 acres, it was one contiguous block, and it still is.
Albert Einstein's special principle of relativity is given credit for opening the door to nuclear energy. So there is a bit of irony in Einstein's quote, "Look deep into nature, and then you will understand everything better."
In the 50s and 60s, Dawson Forest played a unique role in American history. Today, it serves a different purpose: to protect and conserve our water supply. I'm Sharon Collins. We'll see you next time.